One more. I think one more. You've been doing good. You're hanging with me. This is tough stuff. I will not lie to you. If this is new, this will be tough stuff. For some of you, maybe you've taken your copy of John Collins and you've thrown him across the room a few times this week. Let me go ahead and tell you, that will not get easier. You might not like John Collins, but that's okay. Read him anyway. All right, we've been talking a lot about the biblical text. We've been looking at it closely. We've been talking about source criticism. We've been talking about what's in the text, but we haven't touched on what the text actually means, which is a shame because, especially if you think about the creation stories, they are deep and rich. I would say that for most of us on any given day, we need to wake up clinging to the truth that we are created in the image and likeness of God. Right? Like, you got all this stuff in front of you, you got all these things you got to do, you're working a full-time job, you might have a family, you might be parenting, you might be doing all sorts of things, and it can get so stressful that it's good to go back and just remind yourself, I am an image bearer of the Most High God. I hope that speaks to you. Okay, so we haven't talked about what the text means or how it means. To do that, I'm going to say something that might be controversial, I don't know, but to do that, we need to go outside of the Bible. It sounds counterintuitive. I'm not saying that the Bible doesn't speak on its own, but I'm saying if you want to understand an ancient text, you might have to dip into an ancient context. Now, this would not have been something that somebody said prior to the 19th century, but since then, scholars have found all sorts of things to add layers of understanding, not only to the primeval history, but to the Bible. It's difficult to overestimate the importance of the many extra-biblical textual finds of the 19th century and their eventual decipherment. Now, those stories are fascinating. If you're a history buff or if you like Indiana Jones, those stories of how people came to understand these ancient texts, they are well worth reading. But I'm not going to talk about that at all here. Hayes has a little bit about that in this book here, Hidden Riches. Chris Hayes, if you don't know, is an Old Testament professor at Fuller Seminary. He's awesome. Make sure you take some of his courses. But his book here really is in his wheelhouse, and he talks about some of the initial decipherments of ancient languages. What I want to focus on is the Acadian texts and Ugaritic texts. Both of these are within the same language family as Hebrew. I want to talk about the many texts in Acadian and Ugaritic that were unearthed in and around the 19th century and how they completely revolutionized the field of Old Testament studies, because what scholars found and what they read in these texts from outside of the Bible, mind you, were stories and concepts and religious language that's very, 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 very similar to the Old Testament. In fact, the similarities actually sparked a controversy in German biblical scholarship, which is where a lot of things find their origin, called the Bibel und Babel controversy, Bible and Babylon, where some scholars began to claim that the Bible was not unique. Instead, it was a ripoff of other Babylonian sources. So here's what I'm talking about. You've got the Acadian text Enuma Elish, which probably predates our Genesis text. Okay, one point of clarification here, because the text copies that we possess were found in Ashurbanipal's library, which dates to the 7th century BC. But most think that the story of Enuma Elish, it originated much earlier than that, maybe in the 18th century BC, or possibly a bit later in the 14th to 12th centuries BC. But either way, these dates are in the more distant past than our Bibles. Side note, they also suggest these dates because this is when Marduk the god of the Babylonians was really emphasized. Sorry, struggling for words there. So because of the role that Marduk plays in the story, and because we can link it to when the role of Marduk was emphasized in these communities, some people find them to be brought together in that way. Now, you'll get most of the details of Enuma Elish in your reading, so just for the sake of overview, here we go. Enuma Elish is a creation story. In fact, it's known as the Babylonian Genesis. And here's the story in a nutshell, okay? It begins in this way. It says, when skies above were not yet named, nor earth below pronounced by name, Apsu, the first one, their begetter, and maker, Tiamat, so you've got Apsu and you've got Tiamat. Tiamat bore them all. They had mixed their waters together, but had not formed pastures nor discovered reed beds. When no gods were manifest, nor names pronounced, nor destinies decreed, then gods were born within them. Clear, right? Yeah, awesome. Glad that you were tracking with me. That's good. All right, just to bring all the details to the surface here. No pun intended, as you'll see. Apsu and Tiamat, they represent primordial waters. Apsu is fresh water, Tiamat is salt water, and their mixing of the waters together creates the lesser or younger gods. Don't ask me how, I don't know. This is like one of those moments where the kid's in the back seat, Dad, where do babies come from? Don't ask me that right now, I don't know. Like, Dad, what does it mean that the primordial waters were mixing? I don't know, okay? We're just trying to go to baseball practice. I don't know what this means, but this is an ancient way of thinking about the creation of the gods. And the creation of the gods, just so you know, is called a theogony. As the story continues, the younger gods that have been created by Apsu and Tiamat, they start creating a ruckus, which angers Apsu, the dad, who can't sleep because of all the noise. I don't know if this means anything to you, but this is like Sunday afternoon, dad's on the couch watching football, and he kind of falls asleep, and the kids are off to the side making some noise, and dad wakes up and gets mad about it. Very stereotypical, I apologize for that, but we're dealing with a patriarchal text, so I can talk in terms of these stereotypes. And dad is mad at the little kids. This is what's happening here. Apsu can't get a good nap because the younger gods are running around creating a ruckus, so naturally he wants to murder them. To which Tiamat, the saltwater goddess, says, we can't do that. We created these people. We can't just go around killing them. But Apsu has a counselor along with him. I'm not entirely sure where this counselor comes from, but he's on board with the plan, so it starts moving. Now there's another god named Ea, and he alerts the younger gods what's about to happen. And to help out, he kills Apsu, captures his counselor, and then begets another god named Marduk. Remember, this entire story is about Marduk and emphasizing his role as the god above all other gods within the Babylonian culture. Ea's father, Anu, who's Marduk's granddad, I suppose, then creates the four winds and gives them to Marduk to play with. Back to Tiamat. She's super ticked about all this. One, she's ticked because Apsu is dead. Two, she's ticked because now Marduk has a bunch of wind and he's whipping it all around. And she's just fed up and decides it's time to go to battle. Through a lot of detail here, Marduk is chosen to fight Tiamat. He is the most honored among the gods. Again, that's the point of the story. It's polemical in this way, where Marduk is being elevated above all other gods. And Marduk, in no short amount of time, slaughters Tiamat. With his wind, he forces her mouth open and then shoots an arrow down her gullet that pierces her heart. Then he takes Tiamat's carcass, splits it in two, quote, like a dried fish. And with one half, he creates the heavens. I want you to get this image because it's important. He spreads out this half of the carcass to create an expanse in the sky, and with the other half, he creates the land with Tiamat's dead carcass. Then he decides that humans should be made in order to do the work of the gods. and that's the story in very small amounts of detail. So clearly, this story is very different when you compare it to Genesis 1 through 3. But when you look closer, there's some notable similarities that appear, some of which I didn't really emphasize in my retelling. First, matter exists independently of the divine spirit, meaning there is stuff that is used to create with. Same as in Genesis 1, remember? God is not creating in creation ex nihilo fashion. God is using what already exists, the primordial waters. It's almost like depicting this snow globe that is yet to have form. It's just got a bunch of stuff, and it's murky and it's moving, and God shapes it. Same sort of thing is happening here. Darkness precedes creation in both stories. Also, light exists before the creation of the sun and the moon and the stars in both stories. Again, another detail that I didn't get to. Tiamat in Enuma Elish, she functions as a symbol of the watery chaos, and this symbol is present in the Genesis narrative as well. Let me read it for you here. It says in verse 2, the earth was a formless void, or remember, tohu vavohu. The earth was formless and void, or wild and waste, however we want to translate those two things. It was without shape, without form, and it was empty. And it goes on to say, darkness covered the face of the deep, the Tehom. Some people have even linked Tehom and Tiamat as words that share similar roots. Okay, that one's arguable, but Tiamat as this form of watery chaos, and watery chaos as a thing within Genesis 1, the deep. People in the ancient world were scared to death of the deep. So God, having God's spirit hovering over the waters, was a big deal. Because this in Genesis is the creative force that says, you cannot go where I don't allow you to go. God is taming chaos in the very initial verses of chapter 1. We also have within these two stories, you've got Marduk creating an expanse to keep the waters out. Remember, Tiamat is a goddess who symbolizes or represents salt water, ocean water, untamable chaos water. And he takes half of her body and with her carcass creates an expanse to keep the waters out. An expanse is also created in Genesis. So it says here, let me see if I can find this. It says, let there be a dome in the midst of the waters. This is on the second day. That term there, dome, in Hebrew, it's rakia. It's an expanse. So get the image. God is putting a rakia into play, which separates the waters from above the rakia and the waters from below the rakia. This is where you really get into this image of a snow globe, because that dome piece there is keeping the waters at bay in the Genesis story. This is also why when you read the account of the flood, it says that the floodgates of heaven open and the waters from above empty out into the world. And this is also why the flood story is like an anti-creation story, right? It's God taking the things that God did in Genesis 1, or in this removal of chaos early on, and now he's introducing chaos back into the world as a form of judgment, as God is then recreating. You also have the sequence between Enuma Elish and Genesis that's similar, the creation of the expanse in the sky, and then dry land and luminaries, and then humanity. It's followed by rest. So what do we do with all of this? I would propose that we try to read Genesis in light of these similarities. Most of the scholars have moved beyond Bibel und Babel, those controversies, and they're no longer saying that Genesis is just ripping off of Babylon. Most scholars would reject that idea. I think it's better, along with Pete Enns, to say that these stories are breathing the same air So you've got Enuma Elish and the Babylonian creation stories, and you've got Genesis and these creation stories, and you've got other creation stories within the ancient Near East, and they're all sort of similar, and they're breathing the same air because this is how ancient people talked about creation. But look at these differences. Enuma Elish is creating through forms of violence. And in Genesis, it's completely non-violent. The Spirit of God is hovering over the waters, saying, you can't go where I don't allow you to go. There is no filleting of another god and using their dead carcass to create the world. Enuma Elish tames chaos, tames Tiamat by defeating her, by killing her. But Genesis tames chaos by telling it where it can and can't go. And this is actually a theme that recurs throughout the Old Testament. Enuma Elish is a story of creation amongst the gods. It's set up in a polytheistic sort of framework with one god emerging, yes, but it's one god emerging within a pantheon of other gods. The Genesis story is a story of creation, particularly of humanity and everything else, by one supreme god with no other gods present. For the most part, you do have that one bit where it talks about let us create, and you have to wonder what in the world is happening there. But for the most part, this is a very different aspect to the story of Genesis. Enuma Elish depicts the creation of humanity as an effort of the gods to parcel out the work. Even when Marduk creates humanity, it's like they have a job to do, which is basically the grunt work that the other gods don't want to do. But Genesis describes the creation of humanity as endowed with the image and likeness of God. And they're given a job to do, namely to reign and rule on earth in God's place, right? It's like created as kings and queens to rule for God. It's not we're created as people that are going to go do the grunt work. One more thing here. Many scholars think that the Pentateuch is finalized in and around the time of the Babylonian exile. Now imagine these competing creation narratives that breathe the same air but that are so different. And imagine the retelling of the Babylonian creation story with its violence and its plurality of gods and its depiction of why humanity was created. And then imagine an Israelite in this context hearing the story and saying, oh gosh, man, our story is a little bit different than that. Let me tell you. Now, I don't think we're going to get evangelical here with that, but just having these contrasting stories that are being told within a Babylonian context, it would really highlight the differences between these stories, not only of who Israel's God is, but who Israel is. Not created to do grunt work, but created in the image and likeness of God to do God's work on earth for God, as functionally kings and queens on earth. It's beautiful. So we've got these stories here, and for us to really understand Genesis 1 through 3, we've got to place them within their ancient context to see what we can take away from these stories today.